Yeah. 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 Remember? Remember those two as well. We began to look last week at a new Bible study series called Experiencing the Passion. And we looked last week at the garden, and the garden being a place of solitude for Christ and all of that. This evening we want to kind of transition. We're in Matthew 26. We'll be looking towards the end of the chapter this evening. And I'm going to be flipping around to some other verses, some other books as well. We want to transition this evening from the garden after his arrest, after Peter misses, and Christ's arrest, and John tells us he's actually bound and is taken to the high priest. So we're going to go to the courtyard of the high priest this evening and look at some things there. My father-in-law likes to watch Judge Judy and what's the other one? Judge Brown. That's the one. I used to like to watch Wapner. I can remember watching Wapner. But anyway, and some of those folks on there, and I kind of like Judge Judy. She doesn't. When they say something, she just kind of gives them that look like, and then she's one of those Jim that kind of says what she thinks. And as I was preparing for this, I was kind of looking at some things that you hear out of courtrooms. Let me just give you a couple of these. Mrs. Jones, is your appearance this morning pursuant to a deposition notice which I sent to your attorney? No, this is how I dress when I go to work. Could you see him from where you were standing? I could see his head. And where was his head? Just above his shoulders. You say the stairs went down to the basement? Yes. And these stairs, did they go up also? I tell you what, the ones I climbed today did. They called it the stairway to heaven. Whew. I'll tell you what, by the time I got done, I thought I was there. Yeah. I like this one. A judge trying to prepare a jury for trial said this: "Now as we begin, I must ask you to banish all present information and prejudice from your minds, if you have any." Punctuation always makes a big difference, doesn't it? As we begin here in the last part of Matthew 26, we see that these guys are intent on trying Jesus. We see that those that were intent on doing so, they were filled with prejudice. They were filled with a hatred, if you want to call it that. And basically their minds had been made up before they ever heard anything that anybody had to say about Christ. Last week we focused on the prayer of Jesus there in the Garden of Gethsemane. We talked about how that represents a place of support for him, a place of sorrow, a place of solitude, a place of struggle, a place of submission, and finally a place of strength. Now, as we get ready to start this evening, I want to kind of recap a few things, because it's important for us to remember that Christ actually went through 6 different trials. And so we're going to look at some of those, not in depth really this evening, because I want to get down to the part with Caiaphas, and we want to look at both the hypocrisy of Caiaphas and the hypocrisy of Peter, and kind of look at those two this evening as we get there. But if you go over, and we'll just flip over there, or I'll flip over there here this evening and read that to you. In John chapter 18, we have him before the high priest that was not Caiaphas. Okay? Let me get over there here real quick. I'll read that to you here this evening. 18. In chapter 18, beginning in verse 12, it says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, who was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people." I want to stop right there for just a minute, because I want to talk about Annas for just a minute. He was a high priest. Now, wait a minute, Matt. Didn't you just say Caiaphas was the high priest? Yeah, he was too. There can only be one high priest. Yeah. Annas was the high priest. Caiaphas was placed there by the Roman government. And so Caiaphas did his job to basically, his job was to make sure the Roman government was happy with what was going on in Jerusalem and in Israel. And so we see there, as we read those first couple of verses there, that he's led away into Annas, because Annas was the closest to the Garden of Gethsemane where they arrested him. Okay? This is the first trial. And we talked about the two having the title of high priest. And according to the Old Testament, the high priest was a life office, but the Romans had given the role of high priest to Caiaphas, even though many of the Jews still looked at Annas as the high priest. He was older. He was very influential. We would call him the godfather of the temple, I guess, for lack of a better way to describe it. And everyone knew that any case that came through had to be cleared by him first. So they bring Jesus there. And Annas ruled until about 15 A.D. As it said there in John chapter 12, Caiaphas was his son-in-law. He was very powerful, and he was extremely ruthless. Okay? He did everything possible to remain on the good side of the Roman government. And he ruled, or he served until he was deposed in 37 A.D. Now, I can see at least 4 reasons why they took him to Annas first. They were the leaders, the guys that had arrested him, respected Annas, and they wanted his blessing on their actions. Okay? And they were hoping that he could find some incriminating evidence against Jesus. Again, I said he lived close to the Garden of Gethsemane, so he would have been the first place that they came to. And here's the other thing you need to realize as we look at this evening. You know this, but I'll mention it anyway. During the religious trial, the Roman soldiers were excused. Okay? And so they were dismissed so that the religious leaders could do what they wanted to do with Jesus. Now, as we read on here, you'll see, let's see where we at. Verse 19. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. I'm in John 18 again. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I have ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said. Unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he said thus, and when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest? Jesus answered, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. I'm going to stop right there. And you see, as we look at that, they began to ask him some questions. And let's stop right here and say this. Annas' interrogation of Jesus was illegal, according to Jewish law. Okay? Because it was illegal in Jewish law for the accused to stand before one judge and be directly questioned. Okay? And so when Jesus answered him, one of the officials smacked him in the face, and Jesus gave him that reply. And so that's what we see in Annas' house. And they send him to Caiaphas. Okay? Now, let's pick up in Matthew 26 and looking at verse 57. It says, And they that laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. And we'll stop right there for just a minute. Let me make a couple of comments about Caiaphas holding court here, because it really wasn't court. Caiaphas, as we said, he was a high priest. And if you go over and you look there in Matthew 27, let me just turn over there. Matthew 27, verse 1. When the morning was come, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. The actual plan, I guess if you want to call it that, to put Jesus to death was formalized in Matthew 27 and verse 1. Okay? Now, you can go back and you can see where they began to plot, but the actual sentence was announced there in Matthew 27. Now, him before Caiaphas was really more of a caucus or a committee, if you want to call it that. because the entire court had not been convened on the charge, to charge Christ. You just had a few leaders who were woken up in the middle of the night. There was a reason why only a few of them were woken up in the middle of the night. We'll get to that in just a few minutes. And look at that, because there's a couple of guys that should have been there that when I tell you who they are, you'll recognize those names. One of them was Nicodemus. The other one was Joseph of Arimathea. By the way, who were the two guys that took Jesus' body and prepared it for burial? Yeah, there you go. Okay, and those are two guys where we can actually go back into the Bible and trace a life-changing experience, a salvation experience, a believing in Jesus as who He said He was experience. Nicodemus over in John chapter 3. And so, then the Sanhedrin sentences Christ to death. That's Matthew 27 when we read that. Now, the thing we need to realize here is religious leaders did not have the authority to do that. They didn't have the authority to sentence anyone to death. So then they hand Jesus over to Roman authorities. And so we see Jesus now, He's before Pilate. You guys know how that goes. It's recorded in all four Gospels. Okay? And so Pilate, he comes in and sends him to Herod. And so we go to Herod. I'm just kind of giving the order of sequence of events of that evening. Herod happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover. Okay? And I think he was curious about Christ and probably was asking a bunch of questions. But the only one that we have him asking that is recorded is over in Luke chapter 23. Let me turn over there real quick. I'll read it to you here. Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 6, it says, when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at the time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. Then he questioned with him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. And so we see that one question that he asks there in Matthew chapter 23. Then he sends him back to Pilate, and Pilate then at that point says, I'll release one of them to you. Who do you want, Jesus or Barabbas? They cry for Barabbas, basically. Well, I'm going to get ahead of myself, so let me just start there. And of course, Pilate goes over, washes his hands, and symbolic and all of that stuff. Okay, let's move on now. What I want to look at, that just kind of gives you the sequence of events. But what I really want to look at this evening is two things. As we kind of think about the courtyard there at the courtyard of the high priest. First of all, we want to look at Caiaphas, and then we want to look at Peter. So as we look at Christ before Caiaphas, let's begin reading. And I read already a couple of verses out of Matthew 26, but I want to read 57, and we'll go ahead and go through 68 here, and then we'll talk about a few things. And they heard, and they that had laid hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and the elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. Yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. And at last came two false witnesses, and said, This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God, and build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose, and said unto them, Answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witnesses against thee? But Jesus held his peace. And the high priest answered and said unto them, I adjure thee by the living God, that you tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus saith unto him, Thou hast said, Nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the power, and coming in the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest rent his clothes, we'll talk about that in just a minute, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. which further need have we of witnesses? Behold, now we have heard his blasphemy. What think ye? They answered and said, He is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, Prophesy unto us, thou Christ, who is he that smote thee? We need to look at a few things this evening, because I want you to see Jesus at this point encounter two different kinds of hypocrisy. Caiaphas and Peter. And we want to look at those for just a few moments, because as we look at verse 57, we're introduced to Caiaphas. Caiaphas was supposed to be the spiritual leader of all of Israel. He was the only one who could go into the Holy of Holies in the temple and offer atonement for the sins of the people. In one sense, and I find this very ironic, he was the mediator between God and man, and yet he was facing... You ever just think about those things? Yeah. So, one of his roles was to preside over the Sanhedrin court. Now, the court consisted of 71 elders, which decided major legal issues, in the Jewish nation. In verse 58, we see that Peter followed, that he was able to come to the courtyard of the high priest. He sat down with the guards in the service to see what was going to happen. We're going to talk about Peter here in a little bit. But as we get to verse 59, it tells us that the chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence, false witnesses against Jesus so they could put him to death. And they couldn't find any. Okay? And so that tells you right there their minds were already made up to go ahead and put him to death, because now they were looking for folks to corroborate their story. In fact, Caiaphas said as much after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. He said in John chapter 11 and verse 50, Nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation perishes not. And then drop down to verse 53 in chapter 11. He says, Then from that day forth they took counsel together to put him to death. Now, let's talk about the Sanhedrin for just a minute. The Sanhedrin originated in Numbers chapter 13. I'm sorry, Numbers chapter 11. That looked like a 3. And 70 elders were appointed to help carry out the burden of leading the people, so that Moses didn't have to do it all by himself. And so in the New Testament, the Sanhedrin functioned much like a religious Supreme Court, I guess, for lack of a better way to call it. Consisted of 23 priests, 23 elders, and 23 scribes or lawyers. And 2 presidents. It doesn't say anything. I couldn't find anything about it being a president and a vice president. It just said 2 presidents. So, now, let me give you the qualifications of the members of the Sanhedrin. Listen to this. They were to be men of character, educated in the law, able to understand Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic, and be humble. I'm sorry. Yeah. But we see these leaders, if you go over in Luke chapter 22, they're unbelieving. They're interested in their own survival. That's what John chapter 11, we talked about that. They're filled with envy. If you go down to in chapter 27 of Matthew, it's there. And in Matthew chapter 20, let me go back here a verse and read something to you here real quick. Where do I want to go? Here it is. In Matthew 26 and verse 4 it says, And they consulted that they might take Jesus by subtlety and kill him. In that verse you get a glimpse into their heart even. And so it's interesting that in their plot to condemn and to kill Jesus, that they couldn't even find any witnesses to corroborate their story. And so, even though it says there, we read it, it says that they had many false witnesses come forward, but they didn't have enough evidence. And finally they get 2 guys there in verse 61 to come forward, and they say, This guy said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it again in 3 days. Now he said that, but not quite that way. That's not quite how Jesus said it. And this charge here was significant for death for 2 reasons. First of all, it was considered a capital offense to destroy the temple. And second, the Jews believed that when the Messiah would come, he would demolish the old temple and build a new temple. Now, the authorities were saying that Jesus, because he claimed that he could destroy the temple of God and build a new temple, he was claiming to be the Messiah, and that's where they got the blasphemy charge. Okay? That's where the whole thought of, that's how they were able to accuse him of blasphemy. Now, it's not too surprising that these two witnesses didn't have it right. In John chapter 2 and verse 19, Jesus actually said, destroy this temple, and I'll build it, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And he wasn't talking about the temple that Solomon built. He was talking about his body. Okay? He was talking about his body. So you go on there in John 2 and 21, he explains that. Now, in any case, in Mark chapter 14, it tells us that their testimony didn't agree with each other. Okay, you can go over and read that later. We won't read that now. It's Mark 14 and 59. Now, Jewish law says that once these two witnesses, their testimony contradicted each other, immediately the accused was to be released. The case was dropped. It was, and all of that. That's what should have happened. Okay. In fact, under Jewish law, to bear false witness like that was a crime punishable by death. That's what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 19. And so time is ticking away for this group. And so this is a kangaroo court, by the way. Okay. And so as time's beginning to tick away, they're under really 3 or 4 time crunches here as we look at this evening. The first thing is you got to remember what time of the week it is. Okay. They're approaching nightfall. Nightfall means the beginning of the Sabbath. They couldn't do anything about him. Okay? They couldn't do anything about it. This would have been evening on Friday at sundown. And they wanted to try Jesus quickly because they couldn't do anything with him on Saturday. So they had a timeline there hour-wise. Now, the other thing was it was the requirement of their law. Now, according to Jewish law, if the accused was declared innocent after one vote, that was the end of it. Now, in a capital case, if 37 or more members voted for death, they were required to go home and sleep for a night before voting again the next day. They were supposed to pray and to think of ways to acquit the accused. In other words, to give them a 24-hour waiting period before they pronounce sentence. Okay? Now, since it was already nighttime, this is probably what they did. They wanted to quickly decide the matter in order to fulfill and I'm going to use the air quotes here, the letter of the law. Sometime after midnight, they came back and said, okay? Sometime after nightfall, they came back and said. In other words, they only waited a couple of hours. The other thing they had working against them was Pilate's schedule. And we already said that they didn't have the power. The religious leaders didn't have the power to put anybody to death. They didn't have the ability to pronounce a capital punishment like that. And so they had to go and make a politically correct case to the Roman governor, Pilate, if they wanted to do all of this before the Sabbath, because Pilate only worked in the morning. Pretty easy schedule to have, isn't it, Dave? And here's the other thing, and I kind of wanted to, I hit on this a few minutes ago, is the popularity of Jesus. Okay? If they didn't move fast, Jesus' popularity with the crowds in Jerusalem would have forced them to release him. Okay? And that would have made him a hero. They couldn't let that happen. And so Caiaphas came up with a brilliant idea in verse 62. He stood, he asked Jesus a question. Now, let's stop here and talk about that, because when he stood up, his actions were illegal. Okay? It was illegal for the president because the president was to be still and the accused was not to be attacked directly. Okay? So, they did that, and of course Jesus doesn't say a thing, fulfilling Scripture. Isaiah 53:7, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet did he not open his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, as a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. He fulfilled Scripture. And then because he was unable to find two witnesses who agreed, Caiaphas called on God. Did you catch that when we read through it? As the ultimate witness, and put Jesus under a solemn oath. There in verse 63 says, I charge you under the oath of God. Or let's see, how did he word that? I adjure thee by the living God that you tell us whether or not you're the Son of God. So, if Jesus, and they had a real good knack of trying to get Jesus in a catch-22 situation. Usually it didn't work for him. You know that? Jesus, if he had said, if he had answered If he refused to answer, first of all, he would be breaking a holy oath and be held guilty. If he told the truth, he would be accused of blasphemy. So we see in verse 64, we see his answer. And he says, Jesus said unto them, Thou hast said. You said it, not me. Okay? Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of the heavens. And they asked the question and they got more than they bargained for, didn't they? They kind of got more than they expected with his answer, because not only did Jesus declare that he was the Messiah, he quoted Daniel chapter 7 and Psalms 110. He also showed that before long the roles are going to be reversed. The roles are going to be reversed, and he's going to be passing judgment on them. And that's what he's saying there. And so in a show of holy hypocrisy, we'll call it that, Caiaphas stands up and he rends his clothes. Let me read a verse to you. Leviticus 21 and 10. And he that is the high priest among his brethren, upon whose head the anointing oil was poured, that is consecrated to put on the garment, shall not uncover his head, nor rend his clothes. Nor rend his clothes. And so I'm going to give you my thought here on why he did that. Because he believed that he was declaring that Jesus was committing blasphemy. Okay? And for Jesus to declare that he was the Son of God, folks, it wasn't blasphemy. It was a fact, and we know that. We know that. The group then declares Jesus is worthy of death, and they let loose on him there in 67 and 68. They spit on his face. They smack him around. And at this point, Jesus is blindfolded probably, or his eyes are so swollen that he can't see. And they're saying, prophesy, tell us who it was that just hit you. You know? All right, let's drop down here, and we'll look at Peter before we run out of time. Because Caiaphas was not the only one not expressing an authentic walk with God, because we have another example of hypocrisy. Unfortunately, not too far from where all of this is going on. And as I studied this afternoon, I couldn't help but think about the sermon that Roger preached. Don't shoot the rooster. You remember that? Yeah. We see that, we already read there that Peter followed after Jesus was arrested. They all scattered, but Peter followed not too far, just afar off there. And he comes into the courtyard. And we know that Jesus had warned Peter that before the night was over, he was going to deny him 3 times. And of course, Peter says, "Oh, no, Lord, I'll never do that." Okay? Matthew 26, 69 and 70. Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel came unto him, saying, "Thou was also with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied before them all, saying, "I know not what thou sayest." That's denial number 1. Okay? And you know, I want to stop and say this. We give Peter a hard rap. Oh, he's the guy that, he's walking on the water, he takes his eyes off the Lord, and he starts to sink, and he's denying Christ, and all of these things. Look how the Lord used Peter over in the book of Acts. And we're real quick to give Peter a hard rap for all the things that he did. But this is the same guy that just a few hours ago was chopping off Malchus's ear. Aiming for his head and hitting his ear. He's the same guy that says, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you," over in Luke chapter 22, even to prison and to death. And we know from John chapter 18 that John somehow was allowed access to into the trial, and he found a way for Peter to get into the courtyard. Probably, maybe this servant girl that comes up to Peter was the one that John said, "Hey, you need to let that guy in." I don't know. I'm reading between the lines. And so she says, "Well, I know John was with him. I bet he was with him too." And so she goes up and says, "Hey, you were with Jesus of Galilee." And there's a couple of things, and we kind of need to look at all the accounts to kind of put this together. But over in Luke chapter 22, it says that she looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." And I think, keep in mind where Peter's at. He's warming himself by the fire. He's staying warm. There's a whole sermon message right there, but I won't go there tonight. And so, she's kind of, he looks like a Galilean. He looks a little different. There's something. And she says, "You're with Jesus." And of course then Peter's caught off guard. He pleads ignorance and goes on. Now, pick up in verse 71. "And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid saw him and said unto him, said unto them that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied with an oath this time, I don't even know the man. It gets a little stronger as we go along, doesn't it? He gets up and he moves towards the door. Mark tells us that he'd been warming himself by the fire, and now things are even getting a little too hot for him. And so he moves to the porch there, and Peter tries to get out of there. He's trying to get out, and then another girl spots him. Them girls will get you in trouble, you know. And they spot him and says, you know, and Peter calls out an oath then and refers to Jesus as that man. I don't even know that man is what he says there. As if they were complete strangers. They didn't even know him. Don't know who he is. And then, 73 and 74. And after a while came unto him they that stood by and said to Peter, Surely thou art also one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the rooster crowed. He goes from just saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. To making an oath, to now he's cussing like a fisherman. And yes, Dave, that makes it a salty sermon. Just so Herb would know. And if you go over in Luke chapter 22, it says about an hour later is where we're at. After the news about Peter had spread, that he began to call down these curses, and he swore, I don't know the man. And I think one of these accusers was probably a relative of Malchus. It's somewhere in there. I can't remember now where it's at. And he was the guard that Peter chopped his ear off. Okay, and they were certain that Peter was one of the disciples because your speech gives you away. I have that problem, you know. The way I talk gives me away. I'll tell you a story about that. We don't have time today. Here's the deal, and let's just wrap this up with just a couple of simple thoughts this evening. Caiaphas pretended to be more spiritual than he was. Okay, Caiaphas pretended to be something that he wasn't, and Peter pretended to be worse than he was. Caiaphas was an obvious hypocrite, saying one thing, doing another. Okay, Peter practiced reverse hypocrisy, and this is probably the most common among Christians today. And it's one of those things where we try to fit in. We act like the rest of the world acts. The Bible tells us to come out from among them, be ye separate from them. Okay, and so it's one of those things where we just try to fit in, and the Bible says we're supposed to be a peculiar people. You invite somebody to church, and what's the first thing they say? All them bunch of hypocrites, I don't want to hang out with them. You know, and sometimes they're right. We come to church and we do our thing on Sunday morning. Maybe sometimes on Sunday night. Occasionally, if the preacher can coax us out on a Wednesday night, we're here. But the rest of the week, we're doing what we want to do anyway. And I'm talking in general terms, okay? I'm not talking about anyone in particular. I'm talking in general, the kind of the way we are. And we see Peter, and let's just wrap this up with this thought. We see Peter, immediately the cock crows, read verse 75. And Peter remembered the words of Jesus, which said unto him, Before the cock crows, thou shalt deny me thrice. And he went out and he wept bitterly. And I think at some point in time, and I don't remember now exactly where it is, I think it's maybe in Mark, I can't remember, where Jesus and Peter make eye contact. And it's just kind of like, I'd say all the color drained from his face, and he immediately goes out and he weeps. Now, roosters normally crowed. You ever had a rooster? We had a rooster when I was growing up. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And they would normally start crowing over there between 12:30 and 2:30 in the morning. Okay? I personally believe that as soon as Peter said those words, Lord woke up the old rooster. Get to crowing, big boy. And it indicates there that Peter broke down. And let's just stop right here and say this. Just because we don't do what we're supposed to do doesn't mean we don't serve a God at second chances. You go over just a few chapters, just a chapter or two. Jesus tells the ladies there, go and get my disciples. Oh yeah, and tell Peter. Called Peter by name. The rest of them were just, go tell my disciples that I'll see them, and tell Peter too. They met privately and publicly, made amends, and then look how mightily the Lord used Peter over in the book of Acts at the church there at Jerusalem and advancing his church. All right, lay it on me. Yeah. That's bad. Crow. Anybody else? Anybody want to try and top that one? Okay. Well, let's stand and we'll be dismissed. Dave, lead us.